Thank you, Maximo. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's a particular pleasure to be commenting on this incredible book by David and Antoine. You've gotten only just the barest taste of what is in it. I mean, if you picked up the book, you know it's huge and it's comprehensive. It covers the economics and political economy of the Doha Round, why it has been so difficult to conclude, but it also addresses these new issues that the authors have mentioned, that have emerged since the price spikes in 2008. So really anyone wanting to know what happened with the Doha Round, why and where the international trade system might go in dealing with these issues, development, food security, you're going to have this volume on your shelf and refer to it repeatedly. It's a huge achievement, and I congratulate all the authors, including David, Will, I don't know if anyone else is here. Really phenomenal achievement, and I have only even touched the surface in skimming the book and preparing for this. I think the authors argue compellingly that the benefits of completing the original Doha Round were underappreciated and undermeasured. Nevertheless, it ain't gonna happen, and we need to find ways to move on, both new approaches and covering some of these new issues. So again, some of those new issues being food security stocks, how to deal with those, insurance, export taxes, and these emerging new distortionary policies in emerging markets. So that's one way that the agenda just within agriculture has to be expanded. And I agree with the authors that removing both the new and old distortions in agricultural trade and production remains really important for the trade system and for food security, and that the approach to negotiations clearly needs to change. So I do differ on some of the particulars, and so that's where I want to focus to stimulate discussion as we go forward. First, I do agree that the members should finally, formally, absolutely drive a stake through the heart of Doha. It's over, we need to move on. I think the outcome from Nairobi suggests that some of the developing countries are not yet ready to do that. And so whereas as Antoine and David sort of pose what they call Aceveto's smallest beautiful incremental approach as an alternative to launching a big new comprehensive round, I think I would view them as complements. I mean, I think the reality is in the short run, it's useful to continue to do the smallest beautiful incremental approach, get gains where we can. I think some useful things, the elimination of export subsidies, the clarification on filling tariff rate quotas. There's some useful things came out of Nairobi, out of that incremental approach. And I think there's some more things that would be useful to do that are also consistent with the first recommendation that David and Antoine make in the conclusions, which is to respect the basic WTO rules and perhaps even strengthen those rules. And so one of the things they suggest is trying to update tariff bindings to reflect some of the unilateral or regional liberalization that has happened. That would help in a number of different ways. I think there's some other things in that category, and perhaps as part of the bindings, which is mainly going to fall on developing countries. Conceivably, you could pair that with the rich countries doing something about tariff escalation on agricultural commodities, which would be helpful to a lot of developing countries. Maybe we could think about just sort of an incremental bargain in that space. Continuing to work to improve the notifications and reporting requirements on agricultural subsidies and barriers, which David and his colleagues have written extensively about. Maybe adding new requirements on the export taxes and restrictions. If we can't get the disciplines, at least let's know what's going on in that space. Fully implementing, make sure, rigorous monitoring to ensure that the agreement on filling tariff rate quotas actually happens. And this is probably a little bit more difficult, but I mean, I know in the case of U.S. sugar quotas, they were set back in the 1970s. So maybe we could think about a mini negotiations to at least update the quotas so that they actually reflect trading patterns today. Another one would be, and this sort of incremental approach would be adding provisions, which has been discussed in the past and hasn't happened, but converting specific tariffs. I'm not defining all of this. I don't have time. I apologize for that, but converting specific tariffs, which are like so many dollars or pennies per unit of a product, convert those to ad valorem, a percentage of the value, which is less distorting and also more transparent and provides somewhat more certainty to traders. Those would be sort of useful small steps. In terms of the broader approach, I think Antoine mentioned some of the tools they recommend to try and overcome the stalemate that plagued the Doha Round, including reducing the number of players, perhaps by moving to a plurilateral approach, expanding the domain of the negotiations, and then providing side payments. As I look at that list, I think those are all good ideas. I think the reality is, especially the first one, reducing the number of players and plurilaterals have a role, but I think that's going to be the most difficult challenge. I mean, if you look at the Doha Round, even though there are 160 whatever members at various phases, the reality is that the negotiations do occur among a smaller subset of key players. And that smaller subset of key players are still pretty heterogeneous, which is what causes the problems in terms of coming to an agreement. So I'm not sure, I guess the question would be, would a plurilateral that did not include China and India still be useful? Maybe in terms of setting a precedent, but in terms of actual impact on global markets, not so much. So I think we still have to struggle with how do we find the space to try and find some agreement among these heterogeneous actors. And on that, I think there's this issue about what is the appropriate scope of a plurilateral agreement. And I think the authors mentioned that so far, most of them have been sectoral. We had the Information Technology Agreement, one on government procurement agreement before that. Now they're working on services agreement. They have been sectoral, and I don't think a plurilateral works for a full multi-issue round kind of negotiation. So I know in the political economy chapter, the authors in their scenarios, reject an ag only as being feasible, but sort of when I look at the other side, I don't see I think the lesson out of the Doha Round, or one of the lessons, is that the single undertaking of lumping all of these issues together and then none of them are concluded until all of them are concluded failed. I think that was a part of it. I think it's not going to work again, and so. Also, when we look at these new issues of there are now high and growing distortionary policies in some of the large emerging markets, we have now export restrictions on the table, that maybe there is enough material within agriculture to actually move from the incremental approach to maybe doing a round, which is not to preclude that there would also be rounds on manufacturing and services in these other areas, but to try and see, can we do a deal just within agriculture, and I think that would be worth taking a look at. And within that, then many of the ideas and the recommendations that come out of the book, I think would fit just perfectly well. So, thanks.